He walked in that morning thinking he had something to prove. He had no idea the quiet man 2 rows behind him could have ended the conversation in half a second. Nobody in this town knew what he used to be, and that was exactly how he wanted it. The kid thought he was calling out a broke handyman. What he was actually doing was challenging a man who spent 2 decades being underestimated by people far more dangerous than him. 400 people. 1 exit most of them hadn't noticed. And 1 man in the back row who saw the danger before anyone else in the building even smelled the smoke. In the next 90 seconds, this quiet handyman was about to become the reason an entire town found out exactly who had been living among them the whole time. Chase Sterling had exactly one thing on his mind, walking into the Ridgeview Community Hall that Saturday morning, proving in front of the entire town that his family was better than the quiet, broke handyman who lived 2 streets down. He had no idea that in less than 2 hours, that same handyman would be the reason he was still breathing. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who thought their money made them better than you, stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens inside that burning building will stay with you long after this video ends. And if stories about quiet strength and hidden heroes hit different for you the way they do for me, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe right now, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. But to understand how a former Navy SEAL ended up mowing his own lawn in a town that had absolutely no idea who he really was, we need to rewind 4 months, back to an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Ridgeview, Texas, a town of quiet front porches and 1 very loud hillside mansion, when Jake Turner's biggest problem in the world was a leaking kitchen faucet and a 10-year-old son who came home from school with a bruise he refused to explain. Jake Turner was 37 years old, 6'3", built like a man who had spent 2 decades being tested by things most people never had to think about, though nobody in Ridgeview, Texas would have guessed it from looking at him. He drove a faded pickup truck with Turner Home Repair hand-painted on the door, wore the same 3 gray t-shirts on rotation, and kept his dark blonde hair cut short out of habit rather than style. 3 years earlier, his wife Emily had been killed in a car accident on Route 9, and since then it had been just Jake and their son Tyler, muddling through in a modest single-story house that always seemed to need 1 more repair than Jake had time for. In the garage, behind the lawnmower and a pegboard of tools, sat a small locked case that Jake never opened in front of anyone, not even Tyler. Inside it were things from a different life, a folded flag, a set of medals he never wore, and a photograph of 9 men in desert fatigues who did not all make it home. Jake had joined the Navy at 19, straight out of a small Texas town not unlike this one, chasing something he could not fully explain even to himself at the time beyond a restless need to be tested. He made it through training on his 2nd attempt, the first having ended with an injury that put him in a cast for 6 weeks and nearly convinced him to quit, and spent the next 18 years earning a reputation among the small community of men who knew his real name for being the guy who stayed calmest when a plan fell apart. He deployed 4 times, twice to places that made the evening news, and twice to places that never would, and somewhere in those years he met Emily, a Navy nurse stationed at the same base, who used to tell him that the quietest man in any room was usually the one who had seen the most reason to talk less and do more. Mornings were the hardest part now, the way they always are for people who lost someone before they were ready to. Jake still made 2 cups of coffee some days out of pure muscle memory before catching himself and pouring the second one down the drain. He kept a grocery list in Emily's handwriting taped inside a kitchen cabinet, milk and eggs and Tyler's favorite cereal, because throwing it away had always felt like one goodbye too many. He worked 6 days a week fixing what other people in Ridgeview could not or would not fix themselves. Plumbing and drywall and sagging porch steps, charging fair prices that left him comfortable but never wealthy, which suited him just fine. Money had never once been the thing he measured his life by. Every morning before school, he packed Tyler's lunch, checked the weather, and reminded him to zip his jacket. Small rituals that felt less like chores and more like the only kind of prayer Jake still knew how to say. Tyler was 10 years old, small for his age, with his mother's hazel eyes and a habit of going quiet whenever something was wrong instead of asking for help. That Tuesday, he came home from Ridgeview Elementary with a bruise on his forearm and a story about tripping at recess that Jake did not believe for a second. What had actually happened was simpler and uglier than tripping. Chase Sterling, a full head taller and a grade above him, had cornered Tyler by the bike racks after the final bell, flanked by 2 boys who laughed on cue, and shoved him hard enough into the fence that his backpack strap snapped. "Nice bag. Is that from the trash?" Chase had said loud enough for half the fourth grade to hear, and Tyler had said nothing, because saying nothing was easier than saying something and having it not matter. It took 3 days of gentle questions before Tyler finally admitted that a boy named Chase Sterling had been shoving him around by the bike racks, calling him names, mostly because Tyler's backpack was 3 years old and Chase's was not. Jake listened without raising his voice, the way he had learned to listen to men twice Tyler's size back when the stakes were a great deal higher. And that weekend, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He signed Tyler up for classes at Ridgeview Martial Arts Academy, not to teach him how to fight back, but to teach him he did not have to be afraid. Sensei Alan Park had run the dojo for nearly 20 years, and it took him exactly one look at Jake Turner filling out the enrollment paperwork to know there was more to the man than the calloused hands and modest clothes suggested. Former military? Sensei Park asked casually, sliding the form across the counter. Long time ago, Jake said, which was true and also not remotely the whole truth. Sensei Park did not push. He had learned over the years which students wanted to talk about their past and which ones needed the dojo to be the one place nobody asked, and something about the careful, economical way Jake moved, even just crossing a small front office, told him this was very much the second kind of man. He put Tyler in the beginner class that met Tuesday and Thursday evenings, right alongside a boy named Chase Sterling, whose family happened to be the largest single donor the academy had. Tyler's first class was awkward in the way every first class is, all missed steps and a gi that hung too loose at the shoulders, but Jake watched from a folding chair against the back wall and saw something in his son's face he had not seen in months, focus that had nothing to do with fear. Sensei Park ran his classes the old way, more patience than shouting, more repetition than reward, and he made a point of learning every student's name by the second class, including the quiet ones who never raised their hands. Tyler was assigned a spot on the mat 2 rows behind Chase Sterling, close enough to watch the older boy show off during warm-ups, and Jake noticed the way his son's shoulders tightened every time Chase glanced back at him. By the end of the hour, Tyler could not throw a proper punch yet, but he stood a little straighter walking to the truck. And that alone felt like the best money Jake had spent all year. The Sterling family lived in a sprawling modern mansion at the top of Ridgeview's only hill, the kind of house with a circular driveway and a fountain that ran even when nobody was home to see it. Bradley Sterling had made his fortune in commercial real estate and never let anyone in Ridgeview forget it, least of all the people he hired to fix things around his property. It was pure coincidence, or maybe not, that Jake had been the contractor called out to repair a cracked foundation wall at the Sterling estate that same month. Bradley walked the job site in loafers that had never touched a work boot, talking on his phone the entire time, and when he finally acknowledged Jake directly, it was to argue down the estimate by 20%. 20%, Bradley repeated, like the number itself was an inconvenience. I've got guys who do this for half what you're asking, but Vanessa likes supporting local, so, he said, local the way some men say a word they consider slightly beneath them. Jake looked at the crack running the length of the foundation wall, calculated the materials cost in his head, and quoted the same fair price he would have quoted anyone else in Ridgeview, because dropping his rate for a man who could clearly afford it would have meant something different than kindness. Bradley sighed like he was doing Jake a favor by agreeing to it at all. I'm sure a guy like you is grateful for the work, Bradley said, not quite looking up from his phone, and Jake, who had once gone 11 days without a hot meal in a place far worse than a Texas hillside mansion, simply nodded and got back to work. At the dojo, Chase Sterling wore his brand new white belt like a trophy, even though he had been training for less than 3 months and skipped more classes than he attended, always with a private lesson scheduled to make up for it that somehow never quite happened. He was faster to talk than to listen, faster to brag than to drill, and he had picked up, the way children sometimes do, exactly the same way of looking at people that his father used. During a sparring drill in his 3rd week, Chase caught Tyler with an elbow that was rougher than the beginner rules allowed, hard enough to leave Tyler doubled over and blinking back tears in front of the entire class. The room went quiet the way a room does right before someone decides whether to make it worse. Chase stood over Tyler for a beat too long, not offering a hand, waiting to see if anyone would call it what it was. A few of the other kids exchanged looks. Nobody said anything, because everybody in that dojo, students and parents alike, understood without being told exactly whose name was on the new mats they were standing on. Sensei Park stopped the drill immediately and pulled Chase aside, But the conversation that followed was shorter and gentler than it should have been, and everyone in the room understood exactly why. Nobody wanted to be the instructor who lost the Sterling family's sponsorship over a bruised elbow. Jake, watching from the sideline chairs where parents were allowed to observe, said nothing in the moment, though his jaw tightened in a way Tyler had only seen a handful of times in his life, usually late at night when Jake thought his son was already asleep. What almost nobody in Ridgeview knew, including Tyler, was that Chase's bravado had very little to do with confidence. His father expected trophies the way other fathers expected good report cards, and Chase, who was neither a natural athlete nor particularly interested in martial arts beyond the status it bought him, spent most nights alone in the mansion's home gym trying and failing to master forms he had rushed through in class. Terrified of the day his father would realize the private lessons were not working. Being cruel to a smaller, poorer kid was, in its own sad way, the only reliable trick Chase had found for feeling like he was winning at something. Jake was waiting in the parking lot when class let out, and it was there that Chase Sterling, still riding the high of humiliating a smaller kid in front of his peers, walked straight up to him with the swagger of a boy who had never once been told no. "You're the guy who fixes stuff at my house, right?" Chase said, looking Jake up and down. "My dad says you used to be in the army or something. I bet that's not even true. I bet I could take you down easy. You're old." Jake could have said a dozen things in that moment. Instead, he crouched down to Chase's eye level, the way he used to crouch beside young recruits who thought bravado was the same thing as courage, and said quietly, "I hope you never have to find out, son. Being tough isn't about who wins a fight. It's about who never needs to have one." Chase blinked, clearly expecting a different reaction, muttered something about needing to find his dad, and walked away confused. Tyler, watching from the dojo doorway, would later say it was the first time he ever saw someone make Chase Sterling go quiet. That night, Jake's old teammate Danny Doc Ramirez came by for beer and bad television, the way he did most Thursdays since moving back to Ridgeview to work as a firefighter paramedic. Doc was the only person in town who knew the whole story. The 2 combat deployments, the rescue operations nobody wrote home about, the reason Jake had walked away from the only career he was ever naturally brilliant at. "You ever think about telling people who you actually are?" Doc asked, nursing his beer on the back porch. "Telling people doesn't fix a busted foundation wall or teach my kid confidence," Jake said. "It just makes people look at me different." Doc had been there for the worst of it, the deployment that ended Jake's career 2 years earlier than either of them expected, and the long, difficult year afterward when Jake nearly lost more than his job. He had watched his friend rebuild a life plank by plank, the same patient way Jake now rebuilt other people's porches, and he understood better than anyone why Jake guarded that old version of himself so carefully. Some armor, Doc figured. A man wears so long it stops being armor and just becomes skin. Doc let it go, the way good friends do, but he also knew Jake well enough to recognize the particular quiet that came over him whenever Tyler got hurt on someone else's account. Over the following weeks, Chase's bullying did not stop so much as it went underground, the way bullying does when adults start paying closer attention. Snide comments in the hallway. A shove that looked accidental. Tyler came home quieter each week, and Jake, who had once stayed calm while under actual enemy fire, found himself losing sleep over a 4th grader with a superiority complex. One night, sitting on the edge of Tyler's bed, Jake told his son something he rarely talked about. "When I was overseas, the toughest guys I ever served with weren't the loudest ones," he said. "They were the ones who stayed calm when everything around them was falling apart. That's real strength, buddy. Anybody can throw a punch. It takes something different to walk away from one." Tyler asked if Jake had ever had to walk away from a fight. Jake said more times than he could count, and that every single time, it had been one of the hardest and most important decisions he made that day. Word of the tension between the 2 families traveled the way it always does in a small town, quietly, and then all at once. At the grocery store, Jake overheard Bradley telling another parent that some people just aren't cut out to compete at Chase's level, not realizing or not caring that Jake was 2 aisles over. At school pickup, a few of the other parents started giving Jake sympathetic looks that felt worse than the gossip itself. Tyler, for his part, never once asked to quit the dojo, though some nights he came home more discouraged than others. "You don't have to keep going if it's not fun anymore," Jake told him one evening. Tyler thought about it for a long moment and said, "I don't want him to think he won." Jake had to turn away so his son would not see him smile. The town's annual fall charity martial arts tournament was set for the 3rd Saturday of October, hosted at the Ridgeview Community Hall to raise money for the Children's Hospital 2 counties over. Sensei Park's students had trained for weeks, Tyler included, though Tyler mostly wanted to attend so he could watch rather than compete. Bradley Sterling had personally funded the new lighting rig and sound system for the event, a fact he mentioned to anyone who would listen. And Chase, despite 3 months of inconsistent training, had somehow been entered into an exhibition demonstration meant to showcase the Academy's top young students. Nobody quite knew how that happened. Everybody quietly suspected a donation was involved. The morning of the tournament, the community hall filled with folding chairs, competition mats, and nearly 400 residents of Ridgeview, all packed shoulder to shoulder under a ceiling full of new electrical wiring that had been installed on the cheapest possible bid 6 weeks earlier. Local news ran a short segment on the event that morning. Families arrived with homemade signs and thermoses of coffee, and the smell of popcorn from a rented machine drifted through a building that had not felt this alive in years. A local Girl Scout troop ran a bake sale table by the entrance. It was, by every visible measure, the kind of small-town Saturday that made people grateful to live somewhere like Ridgeview. Sensei Park moved through the crowd checking in competitors, his usual calm slightly frayed by the scale of the event. Doc had the day off and came anyway, sitting 2 rows behind Jake out of an old habit neither man ever discussed, the same instinct that made both of them clock every exit in a room without meaning to. Jake sat near the back with Tyler, close enough to the exit out of old habit rather than any real concern. Bradley held court near the front row, shaking hands, taking photos, basking in the credit for lighting that would soon matter far more than he ever imagined. Chase warmed up near the mat in his crisp white gi, glancing occasionally toward the crowd to make sure people were watching. Nobody smelled the smoke until it was already curling along the ceiling tiles above the equipment storage room, and by the time the first scream went up, the lights had already begun to flicker and die. What followed happened in under 90 seconds, though everyone who lived through it would later swear it felt like an hour. The new wiring, overloaded by the sound system and lighting rig running at full capacity, had sparked behind a storage room wall, and flame found the old insulation faster than anyone in that crowded hall could process. Smoke rolled across the ceiling in a thick gray sheet. The power failed completely, plunging half the hall into shadow just as 400 people realized, all at once, that they needed to move. Somewhere near the front, a child started crying. A folding chair toppled. The particular sound of 400 people trying to process danger at the same moment, a low rising murmur just beneath a scream, filled the hall in a way that made rational thought difficult for almost everyone in the room. For most of the room, the next several seconds would blur into a single frightened memory. For Jake, they slowed down completely. Jake was on his feet before most people had finished registering the smell of smoke. Years of training that never fully leave a person took over in an instant, quiet and automatic, the way muscle memory outlasts everything else. He grabbed Tyler, pressed him low beneath the smoke line, and moved him toward the nearest clear exit, calling out in a voice that cut through the panic without needing to shout, directing the families around him toward the doors instead of the crush forming at the main entrance, where a fallen banner had jammed the pushbar. People listened to that voice without knowing why, the same way soldiers half his age once had. He had done this before, or something enough like it that his body did not need instructions. Find the choke points, clear them first, get the smallest and slowest moving before anyone else. He caught a folding table before it could topple into an elderly woman's path, redirected a cluster of panicking teenagers toward a side exit they had not noticed, and physically freed the jammed push bar at the main entrance with one hard shoulder strike, opening the doorway that 40 people had been fighting uselessly against just moments before. None of it looked dramatic in the moment. It looked, to the handful of people who noticed at all, like someone who simply refused to panic, which was, in its own way, exactly what it was. Within a minute, dozens of people were moving in an orderly line towards safety, instead of pushing blindly against one another. It was Sensei Park, coughing and disoriented near the mat, who grabbed Jake's arm and shouted the sentence that changed everything. The junior competitors, changing for their next event, were still in the back locker room, and nobody had accounted for them. Jake did not hesitate. He handed Tyler off to Doc, who had arrived with the first responding engine within minutes, and was already running toward the building against the tide of evacuees, and went back inside. The locker room was a wall of gray haze and panicked coughing by the time Jake reached it, low visibility, the kind of environment his body remembered from places far more dangerous than a Texas community hall. He found 2 younger children first, herding them toward the emergency exit, with a hand on each shoulder. Then he heard it, a boy's voice, high and terrified, calling for help from behind a fallen equipment shelf that had toppled in the chaos and pinned him at the ankle. It was Chase. Jake did not think about the parking lot conversation, or the elbow that had bruised Tyler, or the 20% Bradley had argued off his invoice. He crossed the room in 4 strides, lifted the shelf off Chase's ankle with a controlled burst of strength built from a decade of hauling far heavier things through far worse conditions, and got the crying 12-year-old onto his shoulder before the smoke had time to do any real damage to either of them. He was out the emergency exit and into daylight in under 30 seconds, setting Chase down gently on the grass just as Doc's team arrived with oxygen. Chase, coughing and wide-eyed, grabbed a fistful of Jake's shirt and would not let go for almost a full minute, and Jake, kneeling in the grass with a boy who 3 weeks earlier had mocked his truck and his job and his age, simply held on and told him he was safe now, that it was over, that he had done nothing wrong. Bradley Sterling was already outside, having gotten separated from Chase in the initial crush. Having rushed back toward the building the moment he realized his son was missing, and having collapsed near the entrance from smoke inhalation before he ever made it inside. Jake saw him on the ground, saw 2 bystanders trying and failing to remember what to do, and moved without a second's hesitation, tilting Bradley's head back, clearing his airway, and starting rescue breaths with the same calm precision he had once used on a man twice his size in the churning waters off the Texas coast 9 years earlier. Bradley coughed, gasped, and opened his eyes to the sight of the man he had spent months quietly disrespecting kneeling over him, having just saved his son and now saving him too. By the time the fire trucks had the blaze under control, the story of what happened inside the Ridgeview Community Hall had already started spreading faster than the smoke had. A local reporter, filming the aftermath for the evening news, asked Sensi Park to describe the man who had gone back into a burning building twice. Sensi Park, still catching his breath, said simply, "That's Jake Turner. And if half of what I suspect about him is true, that building was lucky he happened to be in it." Doc, standing nearby with an oxygen mask still in his hand, finally said the thing Jake had never said himself. 22 years in the Navy, 2 SEAL deployments. This man saved more lives than anyone in this town will ever fully know. And he fixes leaky faucets for a living because he never once asked for anything more than that. A few people in the crowd exchanged stunned glances, recalculating in real time every assumption they had ever made about the quiet man in the faded pickup truck. The crowd that had gathered outside the smoking building went suddenly, completely silent. Someone started clapping, uncertainly at first, and then the sound spread through the parking lot the way relief sometimes does. Dozens of soot-streaked, shaken people applauding a man who was already trying to slip toward his truck to check on Tyler, rather than stand in the middle of the attention he had spent 4 months carefully avoiding. Bradley Sterling, sitting on the back of an ambulance with an oxygen mask on his own face and his son alive beside him, listened to every word. Something in his expression cracked open, the practiced confidence gone, replaced by the look of a man realizing how badly he had misjudged someone. 2 days later, once the smoke had cleared from his lungs and his pride, Bradley drove to the Turner house himself, without an assistant, without his usual polish, and knocked on Jake's front door like an ordinary neighbor asking for a favor instead of granting one. He wanted to properly thank him, and somewhere in the middle of that stilted, awkward conversation on Jake's porch, Bradley mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his older brother Nathan had nearly drowned 9 years earlier when a fishing charter capsized in a sudden Gulf storm off the Texas coast, saved by a Navy diver who pulled him out of the water, gave him CPR on a rocking rescue boat, and disappeared before the family could ever learn his name. Jake went very still on his own front porch. "What was the name of the boat?" he asked quietly. Bradley blinked, confused, and said it had been called the Miss Loretta, out of Port Aransas. Jake nodded slowly, looking somewhere past Bradley toward a memory neither of them could fully share. "I remember that storm," he said. "I remember your brother too. He kept apologizing for bleeding on my uniform." Bradley Sterling, a man who had built an empire out of never being surprised, sat down hard on Jake's porch steps and did not say anything for a long time. The following week, Sensei Park pulled Jake aside after class, the same way he had the very first day, and this time he did not ask any careful, roundabout questions. He simply said thank you, for Chase, for the 2 younger students Jake had guided out first, for a building full of people who would be having Sunday dinner with their families. Because of 90 seconds, most of them would spend the rest of their lives trying to properly describe. Jake, uncomfortable as always with gratitude aimed squarely at him, said the only thing that ever felt true in moments like that. He said he had just done what anyone trained to do it would have done, and Sensei Park, who had spent 2 decades teaching people that training was exactly the thing that separated intention from action, let him have that answer, even though both men knew it was not the whole truth. What followed in Ridgeview over the next several weeks surprised almost everyone except Sensei Park, who had suspected something like it all along. Bradley funded a full scholarship program at the Martial Arts Academy for kids who could not otherwise afford lessons, quietly naming it after Emily Turner rather than himself when Jake refused to let him name it after Jake. Chase, humbled in a way 3 months of expensive private lessons never managed, showed up at the Turner house one Saturday morning, alone, and apologized to Tyler without being told to, then asked, almost shyly, if Tyler might teach him how to actually throw a proper punch sometime, since apparently the private lessons had not covered much of anything real. The two boys, against every expectation anyone in Ridgeview might have had 4 months earlier, became genuine friends by Thanksgiving. By December, Chase had earned his yellow belt honestly, showing up early, staying late, and for the first time in his life working for something instead of being handed it. And it was Tyler, not Sensei Park, who he asked to help him drill his forms. Jake never did stand up and take a bow for any of it. He kept fixing faucets and cracked foundation walls, kept driving the same faded pickup truck, kept raising Tyler in the same modest house at the end of the street. But something in Ridgeview had shifted permanently. People waved differently when he drove by. Referrals for Turner home repair tripled within the month, most of them from families who suddenly understood exactly what kind of man had been quietly living among them the whole time. And some evenings, sitting on the back porch with Doc and a couple of cold drinks, watching Tyler and Chase toss a football badly in the front yard, Jake would think about how close he had come to spending his whole life being underestimated, and how grateful he was that it never once made him bitter enough to stop being kind. On the anniversary of Emily's accident that December, Jake drove out to Route 9 alone the way he did every year, and for the first time since she had died, found himself telling her out loud that their son was going to be all right, that he had built something steady out of the wreckage after all, one modest, unglamorous, faithful day at a time. That same week, for the first time since Tyler was old enough to ask questions, Jake unlocked the small case in the garage and let his son look inside. Tyler held the folded flag like it might dissolve in his hands, traced a finger over metals he did not fully understand yet, and studied the photograph of 9 men in desert fatigues for a long time before asking which one was his dad. Jake pointed himself out, second from the left, impossibly young in a way that startled even him to look at now, and told Tyler a little, not everything but a little, about who those men had been and what they had meant to him. It was not a grand conversation. There were no dramatic revelations, no medals pinned to a chest in front of a cheering town. Just a father and a son on a garage floor, finally starting to talk about the parts of a life that mattered most. So if you have ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or quietly judged by someone who thought they knew your whole story just by looking at you, remember Jake Turner, a single dad who never once needed anyone's applause to be exactly who he was the whole time. Sometimes the quietest people in the room have carried the heaviest things, and sometimes the truth comes out in the last place anyone expects it to. If this story meant something to you, make sure you are subscribed, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told.